In the early 1920s, as Prohibition swept across the United States, a young man named Al Capone saw an opportunity that would change the course of his life and the history of organized crime. Born into an immigrant family in Brooklyn, Capone had already dabbled in petty crime as a teenager. But it wasn't until he moved to Chicago that his true transformation began. At first, he worked under the infamous gangster Johnny Torrio, a man known for his strategic mind and ruthless business sense. Torrio had built a powerful criminal organization that specialized in illegal alcohol distribution, exploiting the demand created by Prohibition. Recognizing Capone's intelligence and willingness to get his hands dirty, Torrio quickly took him under his wing. Within a few years, Capone had become his most trusted enforcer, handling disputes with violence when necessary and making sure money kept flowing in from speakeasies, gambling dens, and brothels. Everything changed in 1925 when Torrio was nearly assassinated by a rival gang. The attack left him shaken, and rather than risk his life further, he decided to retire, handing over his empire to the man he had mentored. At just 26 years old, Al Capone became the new king of Chicago's underworld. Unlike Torrio, who preferred to keep a low profile, Capone embraced the limelight. He dressed in sharp suits, dined at the finest restaurants, and openly mingled with politicians, celebrities, and even law enforcement officers. To the public, he was more than just a gangster. He was a celebrity, a businessman, and, in the eyes of some, even a modern-day Robin Hood. He donated to charities, provided food for the poor, and made sure that his local community saw him as a benefactor rather than a villain. But behind the charm and generosity lay a ruthless criminal mind. Capone's power was built on violence and fear, and he would eliminate anyone who stood in his way. His organization controlled the flow of illegal liquor, and he had an iron grip on politicians and police officers who were either on his payroll or too terrified to act against him. Anyone who betrayed his trust or threatened his business would meet a violent end, usually at the hands of his most feared enforcers. By the late 1920s, Al Capone wasn't just a gangster, he was an empire. His criminal operations generated tens of millions of dollars annually, an unimaginable fortune at the time. He ruled Chicago like a king, but his reign was not without challenges. Rival gangs constantly sought to take control, and as the bodies piled up, the authorities could no longer ignore the chaos he left in his wake. As law enforcement scrambled to find a way to take him down, Capone continued to operate with impunity, convinced that no one could touch him. What he didn't realize, however, was that his biggest enemy wouldn't be a rival gang or even the police. It would be the U.S. government itself. By the late 1920s, Al Capone's grip on Chicago was nearly absolute. His bootlegging operations flooded the city with illegal liquor. His gambling dens raked in massive profits, and his brothels ensured that his name was whispered in every corner of the underworld. Yet, despite his wealth and influence, Capone's rule was anything but peaceful. The streets of Chicago were battlegrounds. Rival gangs fought viciously for territory, and in Capone's world, loyalty was a fleeting concept, one that could change with the promise of money or fear of death. One of his greatest enemies was George "Bugs" Moran, leader of the North Side Gang. Unlike Capone, Moran despised the idea of paying off politicians and police, making him an unpredictable and dangerous adversary. The two men had been locked in a bloody power struggle for years, their soldiers gunning each other down in alleys, speakeasies, and even broad daylight. Capone, always one step ahead, knew that as long as Moran was alive, his empire was at risk. He needed to send a message, a warning that no one, not even the most powerful of his rivals, was beyond his reach. That message came in the form of one of the most infamous acts of organized crime in American history, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. On the morning of February 14, 1929, 7 of Moran's top men gathered in a garage on North Clark Street. They thought they were waiting for a shipment of stolen liquor. Instead, what arrived were 5 men dressed as police officers. The disguised gangsters, believed to be Capone's men, ordered Moran's men to line up against a wall. Thinking it was a routine raid, the North Side gangsters obeyed, only to be gunned down in cold blood. The massacre was brutal. The assailants fired over 70 rounds, ensuring that no one survived. Bodies collapsed onto the cold concrete, riddled with bullets. One man, Frank Gussenberg, miraculously clung to life, but even as police arrived, he refused to say who was responsible. His final words before dying in the hospital: "Nobody shot me." Though Capone was conveniently in Florida at the time, no one doubted who had orchestrated the massacre. The sheer ruthlessness of the attack sent shockwaves through the city and beyond. Until then, Capone had maintained a careful balance, paying off the right people, keeping the public in his favor, and maintaining the illusion of control. But this was different. The St. Valentine's Day massacre was a turning point. It wasn't just another gangland killing. It was a public spectacle, a massacre that painted Capone as an untouchable tyrant. The brutality of the murders caught national attention, and suddenly, the federal government could no longer ignore him. While Capone had ruled through bribery, intimidation, and bloodshed, the massacre had drawn too much heat. The headlines screamed for justice, and the authorities, humiliated by their own inaction, had no choice but to respond. The hunt for Al Capone had truly begun. The St. Valentine's Day massacre had changed everything. What had once been a citywide issue, gang wars, bribery, and corruption, had now become a national scandal. The public, previously fascinated by Capone's larger-than-life persona, now saw him for what he truly was: a violent, untouchable warlord ruling Chicago with an iron fist. The authorities had looked the other way for years, but now there was no ignoring him. The federal government, embarrassed by its failure to rein in organized crime, decided that Capone had to go, and if traditional law enforcement methods wouldn't work, they would find another way. At first, the authorities tried direct prosecution for his most obvious crimes. Capone had ordered countless murders, controlled an empire of illegal alcohol, and had law enforcement officials and politicians in his pocket. But every time they tried to arrest him, witnesses disappeared, evidence went missing, and jurors were mysteriously persuaded to side with the defense. Even when Capone was openly involved in violent incidents, he walked away untouched. After a brutal attack on his former associate Jack Machine Gun McGurn, Capone was arrested, only to be released hours later due to a lack of witnesses willing to testify. Everyone knew who was behind the killings, but no one dared to say his name. Law enforcement officials were growing desperate. Capone had too much money, too much influence, and too many men willing to die for him. He was practically running Chicago like a king, and traditional law enforcement methods simply weren't enough. If the police and courts were too corrupt to take Capone down, the federal government needed someone who couldn't be bribed or intimidated. That man was Elliot Ness, a young and ambitious agent working for the U.S. Treasury Department. Unlike other law enforcement officials, Ness didn't answer to the local police or politicians. He answered directly to the federal government. His task? To target Capone's massive bootlegging operation, cutting off the funds that fueled his empire. To do this, Ness handpicked a team of men who, like him, couldn't be bribed or threatened. These agents, later known as the Untouchables, began conducting relentless raids on Capone's breweries and speakeasies. They seized shipments of illegal liquor, shut down major supply routes, and cost Capone millions of dollars in lost revenue. At first, Capone laughed them off. He had dealt with federal agents before, and he knew that with the right amount of money, anyone could be bought. But Ness and his men were different. They refused his bribes, ignored his threats, and kept coming after him. For the first time in his criminal career, Capone was losing control. While Ness and the Untouchables focused on dismantling Capone's bootlegging empire, another group of federal agents was working on an entirely different plan, one that Capone never saw coming. A team of IRS agents, led by Frank J. Wilson, began digging through Capone's finances, looking for anything that could link him to illegal income. Capone, like many gangsters, had always been careful to never personally sign documents or leave any financial records that could tie him to his empire. He operated on cash and had accountants who knew how to make money disappear on paper. But Wilson and his team were patient. They sifted through thousands of records, followed paper trails, and identified small financial transactions that Capone's men had overlooked. It turned out that Capone had never paid a single cent in income taxes, a federal crime that carried serious prison time. While Capone was evading murder charges, bribing judges, and escaping bootlegging convictions, the IRS had found a weakness. He could get away with anything. except cheating the U.S. government out of its money. As Capone waged war against the untouchables, he had no idea that a far greater threat was closing in from an unexpected direction. By 1930, Al Capone was still the king of Chicago, but the walls were closing in fast. The relentless raids led by Eliot Ness and the Untouchables had cost him millions, disrupting his illegal alcohol trade and striking at the heart of his empire. Meanwhile, the IRS investigation into his taxes was quietly but methodically building a rock-solid case against him. Capone was no fool. He could sense the pressure mounting. In an attempt to clean up his public image, he launched a charm offensive, portraying himself as a generous businessman rather than a ruthless gangster. He donated money to charities, funded soup kitchens during the Great Depression, and even made public statements about how he was simply providing people what they wanted: liquor, entertainment, and jobs. But beneath the surface, his empire was cracking. Despite his efforts to control his image, Capone couldn't escape the headlines. The FBI had officially labeled him public enemy number one, and newspapers across the country painted him as a lawless tyrant. One of the biggest blows came when the Chicago Crime Commission published a detailed report exposing the vast corruption surrounding Capone's operations. It listed the names of police officers, judges, and politicians on his payroll, shocking the public with just how deep his influence ran. Then, in a move that humiliated Capone, the state of Illinois revoked his gun license, making it illegal for him to carry a weapon. The man who had ruled Chicago with a Tommy gun was now a criminal in the eyes of the law just for having a firearm. But the worst was yet to come. While Capone was still fighting off Eliot Ness, he remained unaware of just how much trouble was brewing behind the scenes with the IRS. Frank J. Wilson and his team had spent years combing through financial records, and what they found was devastating. Capone had made millions, but had never reported a dime of income to the government. More importantly, his own men had been careless. Low-level bookkeepers and accountants, who weren't as disciplined as Capone, had left behind just enough paper trails for investigators to trace money back to him. By the time Capone realized the danger, it was too late. In June 1931, a federal grand jury indicted him on 22 counts of tax evasion, and the U.S. government formally announced its plan to prosecute him. At first, Capone laughed it off. He had bribed judges before, bought off witnesses, and had entire police departments under his thumb. He was certain he could pay his way out of this one, too. But what he didn't know was that the government had already prepared for his tricks. The prosecution had a secret weapon. They had switched the jury at the last minute, replacing it with a hand-picked group of men who had been kept in isolation away from threats or bribes. For the first time in his life, Capone was facing a courtroom he didn't control. The trial was held in Chicago's federal courthouse, and the nation watched closely. Capone walked into the courtroom confident as ever, dressed in a sharp pinstripe suit and flashing his signature smirk. He had spent weeks assuring his men that he had the judge and jury in his pocket, just like he always did. But he had no idea what was coming. Before the trial started, federal prosecutors made a game-changing decision. Knowing that Capone's men would likely bribe or intimidate jurors, they executed a last-minute switch. Without warning, the original jury was dismissed, and a new jury, one that had been carefully vetted and kept in isolation, was brought in. Capone was blindsided. The usual strategy, sending his men to talk to the jurors, was now useless. For the first time in his life, he was powerless in the courtroom. The government didn't have to prove murder, bootlegging, or racketeering. They only had to prove one thing: that Capone made millions and never paid taxes. And they had ironclad proof. Federal agents presented ledgers, financial records, and even testimony from Capone's own accountants, all showing that he had been living like a king while telling the government he had no income. The prosecution also played a masterful psychological game. They painted Capone not as a powerful crime boss, but as a greedy fraudster who refused to pay his fair share, while honest Americans struggled in the Great Depression. This angered the jury. While they might have secretly admired the gangster legend, they had no sympathy for a man cheating hard-working citizens and living above the law. On October 17th, 1931, after just 8 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty. Capone was convicted on 5 counts of tax evasion and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. the harshest tax evasion sentence ever given at the time. The moment the verdict was read, Capone's smirk disappeared. He had survived assassination attempts, wars with rival gangs, and years of government investigations. But in the end, it was taxes that took him down. As he was let out of the courtroom, reporters shouted questions, but Capone stayed silent. He knew what this meant. His empire had fallen. Capone began serving his sentence in Cook County Jail, but he was quickly transferred to the U.S. Penitentiary in Atlanta. At first, he tried to run the prison like he ran Chicago, bribing guards and gaining special privileges. He still dressed in expensive silk underwear, had access to top-tier meals, and even set up a smuggling ring to keep himself comfortable. But the government saw what was happening. They knew that as long as Capone had money and influence, he would never truly serve his sentence like a normal prisoner. So in 1934, they sent him to Alcatraz. Alcatraz, the breaking of Capone. Alcatraz was no ordinary prison. Located on an isolated island in the freezing waters of the San Francisco Bay, it was designed to break the most dangerous criminals in America. And it did exactly that to Al Capone. Unlike in Atlanta, where he had still enjoyed some level of influence, at Alcatraz, he was just another inmate. The guards couldn't be bribed, communication with the outside world was nearly impossible, and his former power meant nothing here. For the first time in his life, Capone was completely alone. And then came the worst blow. His health began to fail. While Capone had spent years outmaneuvering enemies, dodging bullets, and escaping the law, there was one thing he couldn't outrun: his own past. Years of reckless behavior, including untreated syphilis, had begun destroying his brain. By 1938, the once brilliant crime lord was mentally deteriorating. He became confused, struggled to follow conversations, and sometimes even forgot who he was. Other inmates mocked him. The man who had once terrified Chicago was now seen as a joke, a shadow of the gangster he used to be. By 1939, his condition had worsened so much that doctors declared he was no longer a threat to society. After serving just 7 years of his 11-year sentence, Capone was released on compassionate grounds and sent to his mansion in Palm Island, Florida, to live out the rest of his days. Back in his luxurious home, Capone was no longer the feared crime boss. His mind was so far gone that he would spend hours talking to people who weren't there. He barely recognized old friends, and at times he believed he was still running Chicago. The man who had once built an empire, outsmarted law enforcement, and ruled through fear was now a prisoner in his own mind. On January 25, 1947, at the age of 48, Al Capone died of a heart attack. His once powerful empire had long since crumbled, and his name, once synonymous with terror, had become a cautionary tale. Though he had died as a sick and forgotten man, Al Capone's legend never faded. His life inspired countless movies, books, and TV shows, forever cementing him as the most infamous gangster in American history. His story became a reminder that even the most powerful criminals fall eventually, sometimes not by guns or rivals, but by something as simple as tax evasion and time. Capone had lived like a king, but died as a broken man. And in the end, it wasn't bullets, gang wars, or even the FBI that took him down. It was the one enemy he never saw coming: the U.S. government accountants.